I am looking at chapter 13, which is how organisms evolve. Let me get my pen going on here, and we'll talk about it. But basically, the smallest unit of evolution that can evolve is a population. So we need to talk a little bit about what a population is. We'll talk a little bit about Darwin, and then we'll talk a little bit more about modern ideas about evolution. It's kind of good to look at the past. Why is evolution important to us? Because basically it happens every day. One of the big ways that we had of reducing the amount of malaria, disease, a very common disease earlier on in the last century, was to use a pesticide called DDT. Once we started using the DDT pesticides, we realized that many of the mosquitoes became resistant to DDT. That's an example of evolution. This is another much prettier example of evolution of an organism that's able to modify, these populations are able to modify their body type in order to fit in better with their background. Again, our understanding of evolution will help us in our agriculture, in medicine, in biotechnology, and also in conservation biology. And so evolution has a very big role to play in all of these aspects. I'm not really going to go into it that much, but again, Darwin was the first person to not only give us the idea of that populations are changing, but he also gave us a big understanding of why and who this, how this evolution occurred. So he is kind of somebody to look at. And again, he had the concept of natural selection, which is the process by which organisms within certain inherited characteristics are more likely to survive and reproduce than individuals in their characteristics. A lot of jargon in there, but I'll talk about that more in a little bit. But again, here are all the popular parts of a kind of evolution that we see. In this case here, we have insects that are starting to look like their surroundings that allow them to survive being eaten by predators. Again, a population, that's the smallest group that can evolve, is a group of individuals of the same species living in the same place at the same time. And again, this does change over generations. And again, the reason why they have to remain in the same populations and at the same time is they need to mate with one another. This population needs to be active, okay? And then we'll look at evolutionary adaptation, which is basically this change that's due to evolution. Again, in one modern definition of evolution, called as the genetic composition of a population that changes over time. A change in allele frequency over time. And so there's many different definitions that we use for evolution, and you want to be kind of aware of those. Lamarck was one of these individuals who suggests that organisms evolve by the process of adaptation, by the inheritance of acquired characteristics. And again, this is not correct. And that would be like Arnold Schwarzenegger's kids having big muscles when they come out because Arnold Schwarzenegger worked out. And that's not necessarily the case. Darwin was a long time ago, and so this has been kind of an interesting ride on that. The evidence of evolution that, again, Darwin looked at as well is the fossil record, biogeography, comparative anatomy, comparative embryology, and my favorite one, molecular biology, which is a lot. I think it's a lot more straightforward. We're talking about fossils are imprints or remnants of organisms that lived in the past, and so often found in sedimentary rocks. The fossil record is kind of incomplete for a number of different reasons. Here's a picture of the Grand Canyon. If you've ever been there, it's very, very specific. But again, there's a record of the natural history all throughout here. If we look at the rocks, paleontologists are scientists that study fossils. And again, a lot of times they only have partial fossils. So here's the leg bone from something that looks like a whale. Again, beautiful items. I won't go into that, but I'd recommend that you go to your local museum and take a look at their fossils that they have. Biogeography is the study of geographic distribution of species that first suggested to Darwin that today's organisms evolved from ancestral forms. Okay. So he was able to look at this, and so we're looking at, again, populations that are distributed. And one of the facts is, when we look at Australia, it's like, why are the organisms so different there? And again, look at these structures that we have in common one. These are all marsupials. And the idea is that in these populations, when these populations get isolated from other populations, they evolve in their own way, and so it's not all the same. Another thing that we look at is comparative anatomy. By comparing body structures between different species, we can confirm that evolution is a remodeling process. This doesn't really necessarily develop something new, but it's a remodeling. Homology is the similarity in structures due to common ancestries. And again, it's illustrated by remodeling of the pattern of bones forming in the forelimb of animals. And so these animals all have roughly the same bones, but those bones are remodeled to do things like in humans grasping, the walking and running in a cat, the swimming in a whale, and the flying in the bat. These are all structures of the hands. Another thing that we look at are vestigial structures. These are remnants of features that have served important functions in an organism's ancestors, but now they don't have any importance. Like, again, that would be like femurs or leg bones in various snakes, etc. Comparative embryology is a big one. When we look at this, for example, we have pharyngeal pouches. These appear on the side of many embryos, and these develop into gill structures in the fish and develop into parts of the ears and throats in human beings. So evolution is kind of a remodeling, and we use a lot of the same features, but sometimes they're used for very different things. And so here's a chicken embryo, here's a human embryo. If we look at these embryos look very similar to one another. In the past, people thought, oh, human beings went through a whole evolutionary process. That's not the case. In embryology, we're going from the difficult structure of going from one fertilized egg going all the way to a human being, and that's a difficult process. And if you notice my stick figures, even difficult to do. My favorite kind of ideas about evolution come from molecular biology, because I think molecular biology, when we're looking at it at this small micro scale, we're able to understand why things occur. And again, heredity is the background of an organism is documented in its DNA and in proteins encoded by the DNA. The evolutionary relationships among species can be determined by their genes and the proteins of different organisms. And so by looking at molecular biology, we can have an idea of kind of what things matter, what things don't on a molecular scale. And so, again, organisms that are related are going to have a higher sequence analogy. And so that is, if we sequence the entire genome and we line them up together, how close are they? And so we see that our closest ancestors are the chimpanzees, and so we're going to share a lot more DNA homology. Gorillas, orangutans, and other monkeys are very close to us, but again, we don't share that much homology with them. And again, this is really interesting because not only are we looking at the important DNA, but we're also looking at kind of this junk DNA in there, and hopefully I'll get a chance to talk about that a little bit later. And so one of the big things that Darwin was able to do for evolution is, and one of the reasons why we really connect this name with evolution, is that he gave the reasons why this evolution occurred. And again, Darwin in the Galapagos Island was looking at biogeography, and basically we had this small finch, but he thought that this finch was able, populations of the finch were able to change due to kind of what their food activities are. And he came up with this idea of natural selections. That also, but in order to get natural selections, he needed kind of two key observations that he had here, and that all species tend to produce excessive numbers of offspring. So not all of your offspring are going to survive. And again, these organisms vary, and much of the variation is hereditable. So observation number one, all species tend to produce excessive numbers, and this leads to a struggle for existence. And so again, this is a common, this is a puffball mushroom, and it's producing all these spores, millions and millions of these spores. Not all of those spores are going to survive, and those spores are competing for existence to grow and to reproduce. The second one is variation exists among the individuals. And if we look around us, we see variation. And again, if we look at this, we say all ladybugs. If you look at these ladybugs, all of these ladybugs are slightly different. These guys here are different, and sometimes we don't notice that. And so it's this difference that can affect their reproductive success. Those individuals with traits best suited for the local environment generally leave a larger share of their surviving fertile offspring. Generally, this is the point there. Okay, and so examples of natural selection include pesticide resistance in insects, antibiotic resistance in bacteria, drug resistant strains of HIV. And so again, if we apply a pesticide and it does not kill all the insects, we are left with some insects that are alive. These insects mate, and a higher percentage of their offspring are going to have resistance to the pesticide. When Darwin looked at evolution, he